Okay, think I'm live? All right, we're live, and it is great to see you all today. Or actually, you're seeing me, I'm not seeing you. But either way, let's begin. My name is Victor Labrada. I am one of the pastors of Kendall Presbyterian Church, and we are doing one of these every week, Wednesdays. I'll be doing it again next week, Wednesday. And we are walking through what it means to defend your faith. Or another way of thinking of it is building spiritual immunity. And the reason I chose that metaphor is I don't know if you guys know about this, but there's currently a world pandemic happening, and no one has an immunity to this pandemic. Now, there's some people who have stronger health conditions or just stronger immunity in general, but there's no vaccine for this. We haven't adapted to it. So what that means is we all have to be extra careful or endure it, or I don't know, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I am a pastor, and I know there's something that is more contagious, and that is sin. And every single person on earth is infected with sin. And it's only after our conversion, when we receive the Holy Spirit, we've received Christ's gift of salvation, that our mind starts being renewed. And we are able, doesn't mean we don't doubt again, or we never have any kind of skepticism or ever have dark days. That doesn't mean that. But it means that we're equipped now in a way that we can overcome those things. We can press through them in a way that we just could not before. That's what it means to have the Holy Spirit. And in renewing our minds, or in trying to build our spiritual immunity, what we're doing as far as what I want to do in these videos is educate us not only on what the world believes or what people are saying out there, but also on what Christians believe, what the Bible says. It's hard to defend your faith if you don't know what your faith says. And it's hard for the assurances of the Bible to assure you if you don't know what those assurances are. So all that being said, tonight is going to be a bit more of a history lesson. I love history. And if you don't like history, we'll probably tune out now. Before I go on, I have to represent. I have my Wade County shirt on there just to represent the local heroes and demigods that we have in Miami. But what I want to do is present the idea of how we got to where we are today. So, and in a way I want to think about that is how 500 years ago, if you were born anywhere in Europe, you de facto believed in God. You might have doubted him in your heart and doubted that God existed. Atheists have existed forever. But you would have been part of a church. You would have had many, many relatives who believe in God, who have very specific beliefs about God, and who have very specific teaching, and they would teach you those things, and you would learn them. You teach your children, and you have a certain way of praying and a certain way of even interacting with this week that we're in, Holy Week. And 500 years ago, if you were to walk around saying God doesn't exist, or how can we know this is the true God, people might have been violent towards you, but at the very least, they might just think you're a little crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. And today, we're to a point now where, hi Daniela, we're to a point now where we feel like belief in God or practice of religion is an added on thing. Not necessarily that it's strange, but that it's something that you take up, almost like the way that people take up yoga. It's like, oh, did you hear about Jane? She started doing yoga. Good for her. Or, you hear about Bob, he's meditating now. That's awesome. And you might have a friend who became a born-again Christian, and like, oh, good for them. And we have a kind of a mantra of you do you, and your truth is your truth. How did we get there? How do we get there from 500 years ago? You have very specific beliefs about who God is, and it's the Christian God from the Bible, to now where that's kind of a hobby you can take up if you want to, but please don't try to force anybody else to take up that hobby. That didn't just happen overnight. And I'm gonna start off tonight with a reading from a pretty famous philosopher, and he's very widely read, I think, because he's not very abstract. Friedrich Nietzsche. And I'm sure there's a smarter sounding way to pronounce that. Friedrich Nietzsche, something, I don't know. But he was writing mostly in the 19th century, so like 150 years ago, or more like 130 years ago. And he was one of the, not the forerunners of skepticism and doubt, but somebody who just phrased it so well. And he has an essay called Parable of a Madman. And I want us to look at that essay. Just start by reading it. It's not that long, but this was written in 1882. All right, he's in Germany. So in 1882, what's happening in America? Reconstruction. The Civil War has ended, and we're still patching up things. I think we're getting into the Golden Age or the Gilded Age in the United States of America. There are things happening all over the world, clearly. But in 1882, Nietzsche writes this. Let's read it together. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, I seek God. I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? Where is God? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is it not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent, and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent, and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said to them. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been related further that on that same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo, which means a funeral for the eternal God, led out and called to account. He is said always to have replied nothing, but what after all are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God? My Latin's a little rusty, I might have gotten that wrong, but the idea remains the same. So the story, to make a parable and make it even shorter, this man comes in and starts saying he seeks God, and there are already people who don't believe in God and just wondering, why is this guy looking for God? So establishing there's this implicit belief that God does not exist already. Late 19th century Germany and many parts in Europe. That people can not believe in God and they kind of just keep it to themselves, or it doesn't really matter. They live in a very God Christendom shaped world in Europe, but it's not really something that serious, intelligent men and women stick to. And he starts yelling that they've killed God. And I'm not sure who coined the term, if it was Nietzsche or Voltaire, but the idea of God being dead comes from the 19th century and from the philosophers then, who were saying not that God was literally alive and he was literally killed, but rather that the idea, the influence of God is dead. That all that remains is almost this haunting, that the world remains haunted by the idea of God, but in reality he's not there and he's not influential. And at some point, the madman realizes the world's not ready to hear this yet, even though they're the ones who killed God, even though they're the ones who somehow found ways to reduce God's influence, to reduce the idea to absurdity, to reduce Christianity to being merely some kind of private religion that has no real bearing on life. And yet those very people are not ready to hear that they killed God. And then he goes to the different churches and repeats his phrase, and he thinks of them as being funeral, or rather sepulchres, tombs for God. Those are the places where the remains of God can be found. And of course, he's not being literal again, but he's saying those are the places where the idea of God will still remain. People will still talk about God there, but how much can a dead God do? The people in church will talk about him ad nauseum because he's laying there. It reminds me of a picture, not a picture, but something I experienced when I visited Cuba about 10 years ago. And this was a trip with a church that we went to investigate if we could do ministry in Cuba, to what extent we could do ministry in Cuba. And we had flown out of Miami. It's a very short flight. And what we had been told was that there was something of an underground church. But if you walked into a normal church, what you were going to get is mostly communist propaganda. The Castro had taken down all the stained glass windows in the Catholic churches and put up windows of himself and of other revolutionary leaders. And the people had communism usually is associated with atheism, because a belief in God or that there's a higher purpose is at odds with communism. And not just because communists are really, really bad people. I believe they are. Personal opinion. But I'm joking. If you're a communist out there, I still love you. But communism relies on the idea of a big other. Every movement relies on the idea of a big other. A big other is basically what you appeal to push your beliefs or practices. So Christians, the big other of Christianity is God. He is the big other. He's something bigger than us who is not one of us. And thus, if God wills something, it will be done. You've probably heard of Deus Vult and the justification that people used for the Crusades almost 1,000 years ago. And were those legitimate? I'm not here to discuss that. But communist big other, or the big other of communism, is history. That history is progressing to a certain point. That there is a goal. There's a smart word, teleology. There's a telos, a goal for history. That it is going somewhere. And we are either retracting from it, moving backwards, or we're going towards it, progressing towards it. You see this kind of language in politics all the time. Regressive ideas, progressive ideas. It's just, rhetoric to get people to think that they're on the right team or going in the right direction. You'll also hear being on the right side of history. I'm not saying everybody who uses those terms is thinking of the big other in communism, but rather that for any communist revolution to succeed, there needs to be something bigger that's not God. And that bigger thing has become history. So in history, we tend to deify historical figures. So, of course, in Cuba, they would deify Castro. They would deify other figures like that. All that to say, there were, at some point in Cuba, too many churches. Because people just don't want to go to that kind of church where they just hear about how awesome the revolution was. And the state church, if you could call it that, or those state-run places soon became abandoned. And we saw one of those churches that had become abandoned. And this church had turned into, it was part of like a town square, because most town squares, village squares, are built, with a church at one corner of the square, one side of the square. And it had been completely abandoned and empty inside. Really creepy too. Not much creepier things than an empty abandoned church. And that was the first time I'd ever seen an empty church building. I was like, oh, that's really strange. I didn't grow up going to church all the time, but always associated with church with people, or a church building with people. And over the years, I came to meet people from the Northeast and from Europe, and they are not surprised by the idea of an abandoned church or an empty church or a repurposed church. In the Northeast, there's a lot of churches that have been repurposed to be a bed and breakfast or condos or a restaurant. In Europe, there are plenty of churches that are nightclubs. The big open space, cavernous, cathedrals makes for a great nightclub. So these buildings have become repurposed, and I would say Nietzsche, saying this 140 years ago, he might have been saying it too soon. He was right. The people who he was talking to would not imagine that God was dead or his influence was dead, but it would seem that in Europe and in some parts of the world, that's what happened. The idea of God is not influential anymore, and churches are abandoned or empty. We keep hearing about the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, of people who no longer, not necessarily they don't believe in God, but that they don't ascribe to any particular religion. They're not affiliated. They check none for religion. So, all that by way of introduction to tonight's topic. How did the room get this messy? And the analogy will be easy to understand. If you ever walked into your child's room, or maybe your own room, and it's such a complete mess, and you think, how on earth did it get this messy? I could have sworn it was clean just a moment ago. And what I think many Christians find themselves in now today is a world where they don't recognize the world that they grew up in. They don't recognize the world that's talked about in history books. And part of that could just be selective seeing and nostalgia. And it could be your grandparents weren't as religious as you imagine they were. But all things considered, if polling is to be believed, then yeah, we're all a lot less religious, at least. So how did the room get this messy? I want to take us to the idea, and I realized I did not... Oh, I'm going to go get water. Hold on one second. Tonight's class is sponsored by Yeti thermoses, and I bought this for a hurricane that never came, and then I didn't have time to return it, so I own a Yeti thermos now. It is it keeps water cold. I put that water in 2 weeks ago. It's still cold. Yeti, if you'd like to sponsor these talks, I'm all ears. Send your Yeti apparel. So I want to take us to an analogy. So we've been kind of doing this big sprawling mess of is God dead, and the idea of God, and how do we get here. We live now in a place where there are many, a time and place, many acceptable ways to live and many acceptable ways to think and believe. And we say acceptable, who's accepting it? It seems to be built into the fabric of society that we're all kind of just accepting. We all coexist. And even if we don't want to, we're gonna. And the worst thing you could do is talk about politics or religion, because you might offend somebody. So I want us to think about an analogy that I like to call the keys analogy. And I did not create this analogy. This analogy, I forgot where I saw it, where I heard about it. But originally, it's a way of thinking of how we come to find truth. And the fancy word for that is epistemology. Epistemology, how we know what we know. How do you know that you know that? So there is an idea of losing your keys. So I'll tell you a short little story. There was a man who had quite a bender at his local bar. And as the night was wrapping up, the bartender said, you should probably give me your keys. I don't think you're safe to drive home. And the man says, don't worry about it. No, I can walk home. I'll walk home. Don't worry. The bartender says, all right, well, hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. The man goes out the door, stumbling across the way, and he realizes I could just cross through the park. I'll cross through the park in the middle of the night, and I'll be to my front doorstep, no problem at all. And as he's stumbling through the park, he drops his keys. Where could his keys be? He looks around startled and tries to think, where should I look first? Where would it make sense that the keys are? Now, I'm going to take you through a few different places that, where they could be. The man encounters a few different philosophical types in the middle of the night, and he asks them for advice. First person he meets is an Eastern philosopher. And the philosopher tells him, you see, the keys are everywhere and nowhere. Which, to the man's drunken mind, sounds incredible and incredibly confusing. But he thanks the Eastern philosopher and for the enlightening thought and keeps looking for his keys. And then a pluralist comes along. The pluralist tells him, well, have you thought about trying any other key? I mean, they all open any door. The man thinks for a second, and even as a drunk person, he can realize that's probably not going to work, but thank you for your optimism. And then an empiricist, who is somebody who believes in evidence, or that we can only believe what we can observe materially. An empiricist and a materialist would be generally in the same categories. But empiricist says the keys must be under the light of the lamp. This makes complete sense. Why would the keys be somewhere that the light can't reveal? Now, this makes sense for a moment to the man, as he thinks, but yeah, well, of course. Why would the keys be anywhere that I can't see? And he goes looking in the light, and he doesn't find his keys, and starts to wonder, maybe I never had keys. Another person comes along. This is a very busy park, especially at night. An existential nihilist, which is a really fancy way to say somebody who has searched for meaning in life and has come to the conclusion there is none. It's all meaningless. At best, we can create our own meaning, but it all means nothing. Existentialist nihilist tells him, look, I'm going to save you some time here. The keys never existed. There never were keys. The man starts to become very sad. Then a secular humanist comes along, whistling a happy tune. A secular humanist says, brother, the keys were inside you all along. The drunken man thinks, oh, that is quite uncomfortable. Have I really done that? I'm not that drunk, am I? And finally, a Christian comes along and, breaking the analogy, says, only the Lord God can reveal the keys to you. So what do we mean by all these things? Of course, that last one breaks the analogy because we're starting to come to what this means. The keys are truth. The keys are truth, or truth if as a Christian, I would say one divine truth, one true thing, one overarching universal truth that is true for everyone, not just for Oprah, not just for Dr. Phil and for me and for you on different days, but for everyone all the time. So to somebody who depends on evidence, you can only find truth under the light of the lamp, only under our ability to observe. Of course, what this would mean is if you can't observe it, if it's not tangible, if you can't replicate it in a lab, then it can't exist. Now, where this fails, and we'll go into this in another lesson, where this fails clearly, is that we do believe in things that we can't observe in a lab. You believe in love, don't you? You can't see love in a lab. You might believe somebody who tells you, well, really, it's all chemicals in your brain and they go off at different times. Like, that doesn't sound like love to me. We can't even explain consciousness. We can't prove those things in a lab. Yet, for many people, they will tell you, I have to see it to believe it. I have to be able to prove it. Eastern philosopher, I don't mean to make fun of Eastern philosophy, but the idea of when you read some Eastern philosophy, it does sound very deep, but not really coherent. The truth is everywhere and nowhere. Same way of saying God is everywhere and nowhere. And really, you can't know the truth, but you can experience the truth. That sounds nice, I guess. but it's not very intellectually satisfying. And we're reasonable beings. At least most of the people that I know. Few of the people that drive in traffic with me in Miami, but some of us are reasonable beings. The pluralist, and this is really all of these people could be a pluralist. Pluralism is the idea that we can all function in the same society. We don't have to share each other's beliefs. Pluralism, plural. There doesn't have to be one single belief. There can be pluralistic beliefs. So a pluralist, or maybe a relativist, would say you could try any key. They open any door. So if you want to live a good life, if you want to find your truth, try anything. It'll get you to where you want to go. And if it doesn't, you try something else. Existential nihilism, very few people who meet that actually are consistent existential nihilists. They say the truth never existed. The truth is an idea that was created by people to try to get other people to do stuff. It's all expressions of power. And the power holders create truth. They write the dictionaries, they write the history to make you do something. Truth is power, right? Knowledge is power. But that never existed. That's all a power play. And secular humanism is a changing term. It really is. But when I think of secular humanism, I think of really the technical term for Disney. And look, I like Disney. My daughter, Abby, loves Disney. I think if she could fill out a Gallup poll or a Pew study, some kind of census form that asked for religion, she would put down Disney. Right? She worships at the altar of the mouse. But I hope not. But she loves watching the movies. Disney movies, though, have a way of trying to get you to believe that the source of your problems is never you. In Disney movies, typically the source of your problems is the villain. The villain is creating these problems. Sometimes it's your parents. They're too strict. Sometimes the source of your problems is just, people in general. Just there's people everywhere not being nice to each other. And the solution to your problems is inside. It's in you. Finding who you really are. And then when you do that, you can unlock your true potential. And you can let it go and whatever. And this sounds very optimistic. It also sounds kind of naive. And in another lesson, I'll do a deep dive into just tearing apart secular humanism. But right now, I would say typically the source of your problems is you. The chances of the source of your solution being in the same place that the source of your problem was pretty low. But I'm not going to say that you can't change your life. Of course you can. But ultimately, finding truth, it's going to be hard to find it within you because the heart is deceptive above all things. And the Christian, the last person to walk into the drunk person this night, he is right. Only the Lord God can reveal the truth. Now, this doesn't help the drunk guy find his keys necessarily unless God divinely reveals the keys. But what this is getting at is there is lots of truth that you can come across and find on your own. But to find the truth about the universe and everything in it, about the way that everything works, and why it works, and who made this, and who put it here, and what is all this for, and what is the meaning of life, that is something the Christian would say has to be revealed to you by God. And for Christians, that they believe it's been revealed to them by God. So we've had fun with this PowerPoint. So the problem today, and I mostly work with, let me get out of little man mode. I mostly work with teenagers, college students, younger people, and I think older generations are under the assumption that all young people are atheists or all young people hate God. And in a way, in a biblical way, like, well, yeah, everybody, there's no one who seeks after God, not even one. So yeah, we believe that biblically God has to reawaken you and regenerate you to really be in a trusting relationship with him. But it's not the case that all young people are just atheists or that they're just, they haven't thought about it either. Many young people have thought plenty about what everything means. They've been asking questions about God's existence since they were old enough to think who made my parents and who made their parents and who made the first parents. They've been asking those questions. And what I found is a conundrum for many young people is not necessarily that they can either believe in God or not, but rather that there are so many choices for them. Young people are daily told that they can choose from among many equally valid explanations of the meaning of life and the source of truth. So this makes belief in the way, the truth, and the life, which Jesus called himself, seem like only one option among many. What does this mean in practice? What this means in practice is you can have plenty of people, younger people, come to your youth group event or come to any kind of gathering that you advertise as a Christian gathering, and they'll come, and not to argue. They might be an atheist, but they're not there necessarily to argue with you or to make you look stupid. Some teenagers have that chip on their shoulder, but hopefully you only need to get in an argument with a couple of smart Christians before you start pulling back and not trying to get in a fight with everybody. But they'll come to it with a completely hands-off approach. They're not going to try on any of this stuff. They might come for the free pizza for the girls. Maybe a youth group was always like that. They'll come for the party for the friends. But they come thinking, well, this is one thing you could do. This is one of the many clubs you could be a part of. Certainly it's that way at school, at your high school. You could be part of the drama club. You could be part of the campus life after school Christian club. You could be part of the gay and lesbian club. You could be part of I'm sure there's an atheist club. There are all sorts of clubs you can be a part of where you can find your truth. You can find the group that really resonates with you. And why is that? Why is it there's so many options? And really what all that is secular humanism. It is secular humanism which has become the default religion, the civic religion of our country and many places of the world. I'm just going to read a couple of quotes from some celebrities, maybe minor celebrities. The first one, I completely forgot his name. That's Adam from, or the other one, from Mythbusters. And he writes, I have concluded, it's very small there, I've concluded through careful analysis, or careful empirical analysis and much thought, that somebody's looking out for me, keeping track of what I think about things, forgiving me when I do less than I ought, giving me strength to shoot for more than I think I'm capable of. I believe they know everything that I do and think, and they still love me. And I've concluded, after careful consideration, that this person keeping score is me. And then Bjork, a famous Icelandic singer, and if you hear one of her songs, you would recognize it immediately. Bjork, and we're going to talk about Iceland in a second again. She says, if I get in trouble, there's no God or Allah to sort me out. I have to do it myself. And these things sound, to a Christian, I'd say they kind of sound, we would call it nihilism. We would say that, man, that sounds really, really dark. But for the secular humanists, it's actually incredibly optimistic. Because what it means is, well, I always have me around, and if I can fix my own problems, if I can be the source of my own truth, my own judgment, then I can trust myself. And really what it means is, for secular humanism, is the belief that humans are the beginning and end of morality and of fulfillment. They can be atheist or agnostic, and I would say they're not even typically atheist or agnostic anymore. They can be spiritual and not religious. And a lot of it is based on empirical epistemology. Remember, that's how we find out what's true. If I can't see or feel it, I don't believe it. And so a change that I've seen, at least in my time, not only in youth ministry, but over the course of my life, is, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but at some point, it seemed like if you were not religious, it was based on some kind of intellectual doubts. Or rather some kind of like, well, evolution is true, therefore God can't be. Or, we have a track record of science being correct and the Bible being wrong, so the Bible can't be true. So it's these kind of intellectual doubts that people marshal and put forth in a court case. And certainly a lot of Christian apologetics, defense of the faith, has taken that approach of trying to answer those questions, those intellectual doubts. But over the last, 10 years, the kinds of moving away from Christianity have not been necessarily because of intellectual doubts. It's not that people can't believe that there is a supernatural being, a supreme being. It's rather that they don't feel good about him. and they don't feel like Christianity is true, or they don't feel like organized religion is trustworthy, or rather they feel like they resonate, that's a big word, they resonate more nowadays with other beliefs, maybe more esoteric beliefs. I know somebody who is investigating, I forgot the name of it now, Norse mythology. I almost call it, I guess, Odinism would be the term for it. But Norse mythology. And Norse mythology is actually really popular, within geek culture and video games and all that. And I have never thought for a moment that Odin is real or that matters in any way in my life. But they're seeing if it matters in their life. And while this might seem ridiculous to you, that somebody might investigate a Norse mythology to find answers in their life, by the same token, a Viking from 1,000 years ago would find it ridiculous that you believe in the Christian God, that you believe the Bible. And we've come to this point now from at least an intellectual perspective. Everything is wrong, or maybe everything is right, or who really cares? What makes you feel good? So we're allowed now to be inconsistent intellectually as long as we're consistent emotionally. And I'm sure you've heard different quotes in even recent few months of people talking about how stuff doesn't need to be detail right as long as it feels right. And that's the idea of a moral intuition that comes with secular humanism, that your moral intuition comes from you, therefore you should trust that intuition. Now hopefully you can all see how this would fall apart really under any kind of scrutiny. And I'll take a moment to kind of talk about that, and I don't know, give us some kind of ammunition. And I say ammunition, not that religion is supposed to be, or Christianity is supposed to be some kind of gun, but it's a shield. Remember, apologetics is a shield. But when thinking about how we get our morality, how we get the idea of what's right and wrong, for you to trust yourself and yourself only in that arithmetic of where you arrive to that right and wrong, it takes a general ignorance of history and how you got your beliefs. Many of the beliefs that Western Europeans and Americans and Western society in general carry with them are inherited from Christianity. Many of the beliefs in science that we can trust what we observe, we can believe our senses, that came from Christians who studied the world. They had good reason to believe that the world would have order in it because the Creator created it with order. Our morality of helping weak people. Why should we ever help weak people? That doesn't fit in with evolution at all. Evolutionary biologists have tried to, evolutionary ethicists have tried to figure out why altruism exists, or why should it even exist, or is it even a good thing? Altruism is the idea of helping someone else even if it benefits you in zero ways, in no way at all, even if it's a great sacrifice to you. It doesn't make sense. It makes sense to sacrifice yourself for your family, maybe even for your neighbors, maybe even for your city. But why should you care about some tribe of people somewhere on an island that you've never met? Why should you care for their dignity? Why should you care if they become slaves? We have this sense that something wrong done to anybody is something wrong done to humanity. What is the idea of humanity? Where would you even get that? So there's so many ideas that are default ideas that people carry with them that really come from Christianity. The idea of human dignity is one of those. Not that non-Christians don't have that idea, or they do, but they've inherited from Christianity, at least in the West. And Eastern ideas of dignity and humanity are different than ours. Not everybody believes the same thing everywhere you go. I'm not going to go into specific examples, but you could find practices in certain countries that you would find deplorable, but in that country, that practice is accepted and it's celebrated. Who are you to say they're wrong? So secular humanism really, really works if everyone kind of was a Christian when they were growing up. And now they've abandoned all the beliefs and stuff, but they're going to keep trying to love their neighbor. And as long as nobody steps out of line, it'll all work. And it doesn't. History has proved that much. So how has secular humanism come into our living rooms? Because it is quite popular among celebrities, among elites, to have this very, snobbish attitude about religion in general, look down their nose at it. Recently on Instagram, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a video put together by a few celebrities of a bunch of celebrities singing Imagine by John Lennon. I don't have time to go into why Imagine is such a horrendous song. And the tune is great. The lyrics are ridiculously bad. And I'm sorry if you like that song. The idea that if there was no religion, if there was no heaven or hell, that somehow we'd all just become more peaceful. That peace is like the natural state of humanity. And if we all just kind of like did some mindfulness training, backed off a bit, tried not to hold on too tightly to our beliefs, we'd all get along. I don't know where that thought ever came from. Because this is what would happen the moment that you start trying to practice that. You're just going to sit back and just do philosophy and loving each other. At some point, some militaristic group's going to come in and kill all of you, and you will not want to exist anymore. People will have to imagine your existence. Historically speaking, anytime we have peace, we have to fight for it. We have to enforce it. We have to keep peace. Peace is not a natural state of affairs. But it's a very popular idea that if we just got rid of all these restrictions, we'd all be freer, happier people. And celebrities like to, people who achieve all their dreams, have a bunch of money, live in mansions. Once you get to that point, yeah, you start to think that you had all the answers all along. You start to be a little less grateful and start to imagine that really everybody should try this. Everybody should try being rich. Now, this is not just a celebrity thing anymore. This is not just for elites anymore. You know that. We're going to go into our next slide here. Sorry for touching my face. I'm not following the CDC's protocols. But here, a couple examples. So secular humanism it came from elite circles, but it is now acceptable to talk about existence or non-existence of God divorced from the Bible. Like, people don't even go to the Bible anymore to think about, wait, does God exist? Let's go to the Bible. No. You can, which God, whatever. You don't have to go to the Bible for God. But people still have a fascination with Jesus. And you'll see there at the cover of U.S. News, the real Jesus. This idea of the historic Jesus. The idea that, this guy, is a great example. He's somebody who was fully enlightened or whatever. So, he's still somebody that we want to talk about. But the idea of the Trinity of God, these kind of older beliefs that people got in wars over, we don't want to talk about that anymore. So Jesus still has a good reputation so far. And I think it was Flannery O'Connor, the Southern writer, who said that Christ still haunts the South. And, I used that term earlier, the idea of God haunting. And, how I use that term, it means this, that even if a society does not believe and practice their life as if God exists, every now and then, during a holiday, during Easter, during Christmas, during a tragedy, people are reminded, wait a second, we all used to believe in God. Where is God? Where is God now? And people still, every now and then, maybe they might feel guilty for something they did, and they're haunted by the idea of God. And the idea of Christ still haunts us. Even if people don't believe he was a real person. I've met people who don't believe he was a real person at all. That he's just a made-up myth. The things he said are still so phenomenal. Where did they come from? So 33% of Americans aged 18 and 29 claim to be non-religious. These are the nuns that I talked about earlier. A third of people 18 and 29. Now, they don't poll teenagers. I'd say that's probably true for the teenagers as well. Of the teenagers I've met who said they're outright atheists, and there are a few, their atheism was not necessarily because they read a lot of books in atheism, but more about just being angry at God. And that number, 33%, is not atheists. That number is just non-religious. So the people who would not identify with a religion. They wouldn't say they're Christian. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden people are believing less. It might mean that people are being more honest. Maybe 40 years ago, you just said you're a Christian because if you said you weren't, then, people wouldn't look at you in the street. You couldn't run for mayor. When society was more built around the idea of Christianity and Christendom, then there were a lot of benefits to claiming faith, even if you didn't really believe in your heart. You could go to church, get married to somebody, not really believe to anything that's said there, but if you want to get married, you got to go to church. These days, if you want to get married, you don't have to go to church. You want to find a partner, You can go online. You can go on Tinder or whatever. If you want to find out the meaning of life, search the internet for an afternoon. So that the church and Christianity in general has become less of the meeting point, the rallying point for a lot of people. So that could be a reason that those numbers are going up. It's not necessarily that people are less believing, but it's they found different places to express those beliefs. And in 1950, only 5% of all people in America claimed to be non-religious. That's a staggering number, all right? 95% of the country would claim to be religious of America, 95%. You don't have trouble believing. And America in the 1950s, it wasn't like there was a whole lot of Jewish and Muslim people. That's mostly Christians. So how do we get to that point? And before I even get to that, one little, not a factoid, but a history lesson of why we seem to have in retrospect this idea of America being such a Christian nation. It's part of the history we've inherited. We definitely have that in our history, that the founders of this country believed in a maker. They believed he had endowed us with certain inalienable rights, that our rights came from God, not from a government. That didn't make them evangelical Christians, however. Many of them were deists. Some had just very conflicting beliefs about God. Some didn't really practice Christianity, but they liked the ideas from the Bible. But what was happening in the 1950s that would make so many people claim to be Christian? The Cold War. If you look at church attendance numbers before World War II, it's very hard to find these numbers, by the way. People did not run these kinds of polls back then. But if you look at church attendance before World War II was about what it is right now. So if you've been bemoaning that people aren't going to church, they weren't before World War II either. America has had two great awakenings, two great revivals. Some would say three great revivals, including Billy Graham's revivals in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. That guy was around for a long time. But for there to be revival, that would mean that there was a pre-vival, right? There was a point where faith was dead. So America has gone through kind of a roller coaster of faith. America, it's not like we started in 1776 with the highest amount of faith possible, and we've been slowly dwindling to now. But rather, there's been peaks and valleys in the history of the country. So there was a peak in the 1950s, and a big part of that had to do with the Cold War, and the fact that we were fighting against an atheist regime, the Soviet Union. Remember, atheist communists. So the way to fight the communists and their atheism is to fight them with not just capitalism, but belief in God, going to church, having the rallying point be God, be church. So in the 50s and 60s, what you would find a lot of, it, like today, if I told you I have a liberal friend and I have a conservative friend, you would guess that my conservative friend goes to church and my liberal friend doesn't. And you might be right. There are plenty of liberals who still go to church. But more conservatives than liberals attend weekly services. But in the 1950s and 60s, it didn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, you went to church. And churches, denominations started to take the character of politics in the 60s, and that's a whole other history lesson, but where you would find a church that would be mostly leaning one way and another church mostly leaning the other way. But it was a time when it didn't matter what your politics were, you believed in God. You were a Christian. You sang the same hymns. You preached from the same Bible. And that has changed drastically over the last 50 years. At least church attendance has. So all that to say, yeah, there is a difference now. And of course, like we said, maybe people are just being more honest. Maybe a lot of those people in church in the 50s didn't really want to be there. But all that to say, we have gotten to a point now as a country where we have become accustomed to talking about God as if he isn't in the room. We've gotten really used to talking about God as an idea. I'll take myself out of the way here. The story of God, starring Morgan Freeman, and I didn't watch this. I think this is a History Channel documentary, just the idea of God. And Morgan Freeman played God in Bruce Almighty, so I guess he was a good fit for the role of narrating it, and he has an amazing voice. But to have so many different kinds of discussions about God, as if at the end of the discussion, it's up to us whether he exists or not. Like, well, you convinced me. Maybe God is real. Well, if God's real, then it doesn't matter what you think about him being real. He's real. But we've really gotten used to talking about him as if it's up in the air, a decision to be made by us. Now, I'm not going to get to the I think the end of a presentation. I like to I'll tell you something about myself. And I learned this from a professor of mine in seminary. I'm flexing that I went to seminary. This professor, I won't call him out. I won't name him, but he was a counseling professor. He taught in the counseling program, and I took some counseling classes as electives. And there were two counseling sections taught by two different professors. The one professor had an incredibly thorough PowerPoint, notes on everything, a handout, logical, step by step by step by step. You get everything you need to know so that you can take the final at the end of the semester. The counseling class I was in was the exact opposite. And the professor told us this. He walked in, I think, like 5 minutes late. And just like in a huff, like he was carrying papers and his hair was all disheveled, and he had been in a conversation with somebody, absent-minded professor, like the stereotype. But he told us the other class is the one where everything's logical and streamlined and point A, point B, point C, and a PowerPoint. I don't do any of that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk in circles, and then circles are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then I'm going to make a point. And that'll be the point for that class. Now, this could be a great excuse to just not prepare and ramble until you figure out what you're talking about. And that might have been what he was doing. I would not doubt it. But over the course of the semester, I would be amazed at how well I would understand his point. Because all he was doing was circling around it, reiterating, just talking more and more about this one thing in different ways. And what I would come to learn in my other seminary classes, this is actually a Jewish way of teaching. If you read the Old Testament, a lot of the stories, a lot of the Psalms, a lot of the teaching is in a structure that is almost like a circle, or it's bookended, A, B, C, B, A. That the end part has to do with the beginning part, the second to end, the penultimate thing has to do with the second part, and so on and so on. Just repetition to get the main point, which is in the middle. So, all that to say, I am not going to get through this entire lesson today. I was not planning to anyways. But I'm circling around a point that we're making here. And that is this. That the room has gotten really, really messy. And a lot of us want to say the room got so messy because evolution, they took prayer to schools, Richard Dawkins, the morality of this country. And yes, those things have made the room messy. But that does not mean that everybody all of a sudden became an atheist. It seems to be we live in a very kind of binary, right and wrong society. It's like, well, if you're not Christian, then you must just be, you're a fool who doesn't believe in God. And that's not necessarily true. We've come to a place where belief in God is just an option among many. And the people who are really angry at you for believing in God are very few. And they have a lot of time to spend on the internet. So don't spend so much of your time trying to convince them. Because there's very, very few of them. They're just very, very vocal. Really, secularism does not equal a lack of belief. Enlightenment thinkers predicted religion will be dead by now. Every rationalist Enlightenment thinker in the 19th century was pretty sure that nobody would be religious anymore. That Nietzsche would be right. Gallup poll in 2012, which is starting to get too old now. Internationally, 59% of the world thinks of themselves as religious. 95% of the world believes in God, just the general idea of God. But 59% of the world would think that they're religious, would say they're religious, would identify as religious. 23% don't think they're religious. They can still be spiritual. They might still believe in the supernatural. And 13% of them think of themselves as convinced atheists. There can't possibly be a God. Now, they might not even be hard atheists. It might just be that I've seen no proof for God, therefore I'm an atheist. So, an atheism still might be overrepresented in those numbers. Now, I'll tell you a really short story. I made friends with a German fellow when I used to work at an advertising agency. We shared a desk, and conversation came up about God and Jesus, Christianity, and all that. And he was very accepting of my beliefs and very nice. He was a nice German guy. And I asked him, so what do you believe? And he said, oh, I'm an atheist. And I was like, really? Wow, how'd you come to that conclusion? He's like, well, it's not like I've really thought about it that much, but I figured I might as well claim to be an atheist. And I asked him, what is the point of that? And he told me that in Germany, that you have to pay tax to the state church. It's the Lutheran church in Germany. And part of your taxes go to the Lutheran church. However, you can be exempted from that tax if you claim to be an atheist. So he went ahead and claimed to be an atheist, so he wouldn't have to pay that tax. So, little side lesson for the night. If you want to kill religion in your country, make a state church. Freedom of religion is great. The idea that the United States, anybody with a Bible can go out and talk about God, it's dangerous, but it also allows us to have religion that is for the people, by the people, and hopefully good teachers who are speaking true religion, not a government that is forcing religion or forcing people out of it, as the case has become in Germany. Another example of that is in Iceland, and I'll get back to Iceland in a second. I think our next little slide here is in Iceland. Iceland, Zooism, which I don't have a slide for that. Zooism is a new belief in Iceland. Zooism is an ancient Sumerian belief, Babylonian belief. And people in Iceland have started claiming to be Zeus. And the reason why, it's not because they're all investigating ancient religion, but a Church of Zooism has started in Iceland. It's a recognized church. Because it's a recognized church, it gets money from the government, because Iceland gives money to all the faith organizations in Iceland. And the Church of Zooism has promised, if you become a member of our church, we will give you the $80 that you paid to the government for that tax. So people sign up to be a member, and they get an $80 check from the Church of Zooism so that they can get their money back. So there's another example of how atheism and non-belief might be overrepresented. But speaking of Iceland, 54% of Icelanders believe that elves exist. This is a poll in 1998. That might have changed by now. 33% of British people believe ghosts exist. That's a more recent poll. Why do I bring that up? Not to make fun of Icelanders and British people, but rather people from very enlightened and atheistic countries still have supernatural beliefs. Things that I might say are wacky. An atheist would say are wacky. But people still believe. It's almost like they're programmed to believe. So Christianity might be shrinking, but belief is not. We have simply replaced one form of belief with another. So that is our class for tonight. And I know there was a lot to dump on you and a lot of facts and figures. You can go back and listen to this again if you want to. But the main point for tonight, we live in a pluralistic society, but the background belief of this pluralistic society is secular humanism. It's the idea that we can all get the answer from within ourselves. And that presumes a lot of things. It has to presume that the Bible is wrong. It has to presume that nobody has the truth, that we're all just grasping at it, guessing at it. So people typically don't go far back enough into their beliefs to wonder why they believe morally what they believe. But what I want to do in our future lessons is talk about how we can trace this. There's many ways to trace it. Not just trace it, but trace our way back to a more Christian lifestyle for ourselves. I'm not going to do a whole lot to change this country. I can't do a whole lot to change an entire... I can barely do enough to change my daughter. I'm not sure I'm making much effect on either of my daughters right now. But there is something about the way that we live as Christians in a non-Christian society that can strengthen our faith or can weaken our faith without us even realizing it. And that'll be next week's topic. Thanks for being with me here tonight on building your spiritual immunity or build your spiritual immunity. I apologize that I don't know what to do with my hands. I'll get better at that. But thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.